Morning light filtered through the ancient oak trees as I walked the eastern fence line of our property, just as my father had done before me, and his father before him. The Cooper family ranch had stood on this land for nearly a century. 300 acres of rolling pastures, healthy cattle, and the sweetest well water in the county. My grandfather purchased this land back in 1927, and through depression, drought, and development pressure, we had held onto every precious acre. My daily ritual never changed. Coffee at sunrise on the back porch, checking the cattle in the south pasture, inspecting irrigation systems, and planning the day ahead. Simple, predictable, and deeply satisfying. Life had a rhythm here that connected me to something larger than myself, something timeless that most people never experience. That particular Tuesday began like any other. The cattle grazed contentedly, birds called from the tree line, and the morning dew still clung to the tall grass. I had no way of knowing this would be the last normal day I would experience for many months. No warning that forces were already in motion that would threaten everything my family had built. I returned to the house just as the mail truck pulled away from our rural box at the end of the long driveway. Among the usual bills and farm supply catalogs was an official-looking envelope from Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. I almost threw it away thinking it was a misdirected advertisement. Our ranch predated any development in the area by decades. What business would an HOA have sending mail to us? The letter inside was printed on heavy cream stationery with an embossed logo. Notice of Easement Rights Execution, read the bold heading. The document claimed that Lakeside Estates HOA was exercising previously secured dormant easement rights to construct a water pipeline across my property. According to their paperwork, these rights had been granted in a county planning decision 5 years earlier. This must be some kind of mistake, I said aloud to no one but my border collie, Max, who tilted his head inquisitively. I had attended every county meeting that involved zoning or planning near our property. I would certainly remember something about pipeline easements. I called the HOA office number listed on the letterhead immediately. After navigating an unnecessarily complicated phone tree, I reached a woman with a clipped, disinterested tone. "This is regarding a letter about pipeline easement rights on the Cooper Ranch property," I explained. "There must be some confusion." "There is no confusion, Mr. Cooper," she responded without checking any information. "The easement rights were secured through proper legal channels. Construction is scheduled to begin next month. The details are all in the letter." "But I never agreed to any pipeline on my property," I said, feeling my blood pressure rising. "Who authorized this?" "This was approved by the County Planning Commission. The HOA purchased the rights from Westland Development Corporation. If you have concerns, you can attend our next board meeting, but the matter has been legally settled." She abruptly ended the call before I could respond. I immediately contacted my friend Thomas, a local attorney who had helped with property matters in the past. His response after reviewing the documents did nothing to ease my concerns. "They are claiming that when the larger area was rezoned for development 5 years ago, a provision was included for future water infrastructure," Thomas explained from across his cluttered desk. "The problem is that this provision was buried in hundreds of pages of legal language and never explicitly presented at public hearings." "How is that even legal?" I asked. "Gray area at best," Thomas sighed, removing his reading glasses. "We could fight it, but these types of challenges can take years to resolve in court. The HOA has deep pockets from all those membership fees. Meanwhile, they would likely proceed with construction while the case is pending." I drove home that evening with a heavy feeling in my chest. Looking out across the fields my grandfather had cleared by hand, I realized this battle would require resources and resolve I was not sure I possessed. The peaceful existence I had taken for granted now faced a threat I never saw coming. The construction crews arrived without warning at 6:45 a.m. on a Monday. I was in the barn feeding the horses when I heard the rumble of heavy equipment coming down the access road. 3 massive bulldozers, 2 backhoes, several dump trucks, and a crew of about 15 men in fluorescent vests were already crossing onto my property by the time I reached them. "Excuse me," I called out to what appeared to be the foreman, a tall man with a clipboard and white hard hat. "Do you have permission to be on this property?" He barely glanced at me. "We have all the necessary permits." He thrust a stack of papers toward me. "Pipeline installation for Lakeside Estates. Easement rights have been secured." I flipped through the documents with growing alarm. The planned excavation was 20 feet wide, not the 8 feet mentioned in the original letter. The route cut directly through my best grazing pasture and crossed the creek that watered my cattle. None of this matched what had been described in the HOA notice. "This is not what was communicated to me," I protested. "Your plan cuts through active grazing land and a protected watershed area." The foreman shrugged. "Not my department, I just follow the plans." Before I could respond, the first bulldozer roared to life and began pushing earth. My cattle, spooked by the noise, stampeded to the far end of the pasture. 2 calves were separated from their mothers in the chaos. I pulled out my phone and began documenting everything. "You need to stop until we sort this out," I shouted over the engine noise. "Take it up with the HOA," he responded without pausing the work. "We have a timeline to meet." For the next 3 days, I watched helplessly as they tore a gash through my property. The once pristine creek now ran brown with silt. My prized garden, with heirloom vegetable varieties I had cultivated for years, was partially bulldozed when workers missed a marker. The constant noise caused my livestock visible distress, and egg production from my chickens dropped to almost nothing. I called the HOA office 17 times. Each time I was told someone would get back to me. No one ever did. I sent certified letters documenting the damage. They went unanswered. I filed complaints with the county building department only to discover that the permits had indeed been approved, with signatures I later learned came from officials with connections to Marcus Wellington, the HOA president. On the 4th day, I confronted the site manager when I discovered construction waste dumped near my well. "This is illegal," I said, pointing to the pile of discarded materials. "This is a water source." "Look, buddy," he responded with visible irritation. "I get that you are upset about your little farm here, but this pipeline is supplying water to 300 homes. Your concerns are not my priority." Little farm. I felt my face flush with anger. This ranch has been producing food for this county since before your grandparents were born. He turned away dismissively. "File a complaint if you want. We will be done in another week anyway." That night, I researched the Lakeside Estates HOA more thoroughly. Marcus Wellington, the president, was a former county commissioner who had transitioned to real estate development after leaving office. He had maintained connections throughout local government, and I discovered that the company handling the pipeline construction had done 3 previous projects for developments he was associated with. The next morning, I visited the County Environmental Protection Office with photos of the creek contamination. The board clerk glanced at my evidence without interest. "Fill out this form," she said, sliding a paper across the counter. "Someone will review it within 60 to 90 days." "The damage is happening now," I protested. "This is a protected watershed. It supplies water downstream to protected wetlands. Sir, we have procedures. Take it up with the HOA if you need immediate action. I left the county offices feeling defeated and increasingly convinced the system was rigged against individual landowners like myself. Each avenue I pursued led to the same dead end. Take it up with the HOA. By the time the construction was complete, the damage was substantial. A 12-foot wide strip of land now housed an underground pipeline running the entire half-mile length of my eastern property. The topsoil had been carelessly replaced, making the area virtually unusable for crops. The creek showed signs of contamination that would take years to remedy naturally. My cattle refused to graze near the construction area, effectively reducing my usable pasture by nearly 20%. The HOA had gotten exactly what they wanted. Their water flowed freely through my land, while my complaints and documentation sat unaddressed in various government offices. Each night, I could hear the faint hum of water moving through the pipeline from my bedroom window. It was a constant reminder of how powerless I had been to protect my heritage. What the HOA did not realize, however, was that they had awakened something in me that would not be easily put back to rest. A determination to find justice, no matter how long it took. The weeks following the pipeline completion left me exhausted and demoralized. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake planning my next move only to discard each idea by morning. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and friends commented that I had aged years in just months. The ranch work still needed attention, animals fed, fences mended, crops tended, but my heart was no longer fully in it. My neighbor Ed stopped by one afternoon, finding me slumped at the kitchen table surrounded by ignored paperwork. Ed had owned the neighboring property for over 30 years and had watched similar developments encroach on his eastern boundary. "You look like hell, Cooper," he said bluntly, helping himself to coffee. "Feel worse than I look," I admitted. "Did they pull this same stunt with your place?" Ed nodded slowly. Different tactics, same result. They wanted access to build a drainage system that diverted their runoff onto my lower 40. Fought them for 14 months until my savings ran dry. Sometimes I think these HOAs hire lawyers before they hire gardeners. "Did anyone fight back successfully?" I asked, hoping for some shred of encouragement. "Not that I know of," Ed replied. "The Johnsons sold their place rather than deal with it. The Millers gave in after their case was delayed for the third time. These corporate types play the long game, and they know most of us cannot afford to." After Ed left, I wandered out to the damaged creek bed. The water still ran clearer than during construction, but nowhere near its former pristine state. This land had been entrusted to me by my father, who received it from his father. The thought of passing damaged property to future generations felt like a personal failure. That evening, rather than continuing to lament what seemed inevitable, I decided to change my approach. If I could not fight them directly, perhaps I could understand how their system worked. I cleared the dining room table and began methodical research into water rights in our county. Night after night, I pored over maps, legal documents, and water authority records. I learned that our region operated under an unusual water rights system dating back to territorial days. I studied satellite images of lakeside estates, noting their intricate irrigation systems for community gardens and decorative fountains. Their water consumption was extraordinary, 3 times the county average per household. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a conversation with Harold Johnson, an 82-year-old former rancher whose property had bordered the now-developed lakeside estates. "Shame what happened to your place," Harold commented when I ran into him at the feed store. Same thing would have happened to me if I had not sold when I did. You sold to the developers? I asked. Not all of it, Harold corrected. Just the eastern parcels. Still got the lake property up north. Though now I am thinking about selling that too, getting too old to manage it. Lake property. This was the first I had heard of it. Yep, Crystal Springs Lake. Been in my family longer than yours has had your place. Feeds that whole watershed. The developers keep making offers, but I do not like their plans for it. My heart began racing. Crystal Springs Lake. I had never connected the name of the HOA's water system to an actual source. Back home, I immediately pulled up water authority maps. There it was. Crystal Springs Lake sat at the highest point of the watershed, feeding the entire regional water system, including the pipeline that now ran through my ranch. Further research confirmed what I now suspected. The HOA had secured easement rights for the pipeline, but appeared to have no ownership of the water source itself. They had been operating under presumptive access rights granted informally by Harold, who had allowed them to tap the lake output. I spread my financial statements across the table. My retirement accounts, equipment I could sell, potential bank loans, all tallied against what it might cost to purchase Harold's lake property. It would require nearly everything I had, perhaps more. The risk was enormous. Sleep eluded me that night, but for the first time in months, it was not despair keeping me awake but possibility. The question was no longer whether I could afford to buy the lake property, but whether I could afford not to. By morning, the first tendrils of a plan had formed in my mind, one that might finally give me leverage against the seemingly untouchable HOA. The pipeline that hummed beneath my property carried water the HOA had no guaranteed right to. They had been so focused on securing the means of transport that they had neglected the source itself. Their oversight might become their undoing. Hash Bricks Part 4. The Acquisition Strategy, 700 words. The following weeks transformed me from defeated rancher to determined strategist. I called my financial advisor the next morning and explained that I needed to liquidate investments immediately. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "These long-term investments are your retirement safety net. Cashing out now means significant penalties." "I understand the consequences," I replied, "but this is not just about money. It is about something that matters more." I met with 3 different banks, finally securing a substantial equity loan against the ranch itself. The irony was not lost on me, risking my ancestral property to save it. Every asset I could convert to cash went into what I now called Operation Watershed. My next step was approaching Harold Johnson about his lake property. I drove to his modest home on the outskirts of town, rehearsing my pitch. When he invited me in, I was surprised to find another visitor already seated at his kitchen table, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a representative of Wellington Development Group. "Mr. Cooper," Harold nodded toward me. "This gentleman was just leaving. He came to discuss my lake property." The developer gathered his papers with obvious irritation at my arrival. "Consider our offer, Mr. Johnson. It is more than generous, and frankly, the best you are likely to receive for undeveloped rural property." After he left, Harold poured coffee for both of us. "That is the 3rd offer this month. They are getting more aggressive." "Any plans to accept?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Harold snorted. "That man represents the same folks who strong-armed half my neighbors out of their land. They want to build another 100 homes and need more water capacity." He gave me a sideways glance. "I heard what they did to your place. That is not right." I took a deep breath. Actually, the pipeline situation is why I am here. I would like to make an offer on the lake property myself. Harold raised his eyebrows. You got that kind of money, Cooper. They are offering 7 figures. I can match what they are offering, I said, surprising myself with my confidence. But more importantly, I will preserve the natural features of the land. No development, no environmental damage. Harold studied me for a long moment. Let me show you something, he said, rising slowly from his chair. He led me to a dusty file cabinet and pulled out a folder containing years of correspondence between himself and Lakeside Estates HOA. They have been using water from my lake for 8 years now. Know what they paid me for it? Nothing. They assumed that because they had access, they owned rights. I have been trying to get them to negotiate a proper water rights agreement for years. Harold spread the letters on the table. They ignored me, son, just like they ignored you. Said I should be grateful they maintained the dam and drainage system. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. By the time I left, we had reached a verbal agreement. Harold would sell Crystal Springs Lake to me instead of the developers, provided I maintained the natural state of the property and gave him lifetime fishing rights. I immediately contacted Thomas, my attorney, to handle the transaction discreetly. Understanding the sensitivity of the purchase, he suggested creating an LLC to shield my identity as the buyer. If the HOA gets wind of this before the sale is complete, they will outbid you instantly, he warned. Crystal Springs LLC was formed the following week. The paperwork was filed in the county seat, deliberately separated from local channels where HOA connections might alert them to the transaction. Thomas handled all communications, and my name appeared nowhere in the public documents. As we navigated the purchase process, Thomas discovered something remarkable. The HOA never secured formal water rights, he explained during one late-night meeting. They built an entire community water system based on presumptive access that could be revoked at any time. The closing date was set for June 15th. 3 days before, rumors began circulating that Wellington Development was preparing a substantial offer for the lake property. We accelerated our timeline, meeting Harold at Thomas's office at 7:00 a.m. on June 13th. As Harold signed the final transfer documents, he smiled for the first time since I had known him. Use it wisely, Cooper. Water is more valuable than gold in these parts. By noon, I was the legal owner of Crystal Springs Lake, and with it, control of the water supply to Lakeside Estates and its 300 homes. The HOA's pipeline through my ranch now carried water that belonged entirely to me. For 2 weeks after acquiring the lake property, I told no one except Thomas. Instead, I devoted myself to understanding the water system completely. I hired a private water engineer who had previously worked for the state to explain every valve, pump, and pressure regulator. Under the guise of new owner inspection, we documented the entire system from source to distribution. This is an unusual setup, the engineer explained as we examined the main control station. The HOA built a sophisticated distribution system but never secured proper rights agreements. From a legal standpoint, they have been essentially borrowing water all this time. I studied state water law extensively, confirming that as the property owner, I had primary rights to the water from Crystal Springs. While certain reasonable use provisions existed to prevent malicious disruption of established water systems, I had considerable legal latitude in how the resource was managed. Thomas connected me with Patricia Winters, an attorney specializing in water rights litigation. Her assessment was encouraging. As the legal owner of both the land and the water source, you have tremendous leverage, Patricia explained. You cannot arbitrarily cut off residential water completely, but you can certainly implement conservation measures and negotiate terms for continued access. On July 1st, I made my first move. Following Patricia's guidance, I reduced the main flow valve at the lake outlet by 15%, enough to be noticeable in reduced water pressure, but not enough to create hardship. The adjustment took less than 5 minutes to implement, but would send an unmistakable message. 3 days later, the HOA maintenance director called the number posted at the lake property gate. "We are experiencing water pressure issues in lakeside estates," he stated without introduction. "We need access to the control station to make adjustments." "I am afraid that will not be possible," I replied calmly. "Crystal Springs LLC is currently conducting system assessments. A formal communication regarding water management changes has been sent to the HOA board." The certified letter, drafted by Patricia, had been delivered that morning. It politely informed the Lakeside Estates HOA that Crystal Springs LLC was the new owner of the water source property and would be implementing updated access agreements and conservation protocols, effective immediately. The letter requested a meeting with the board to discuss new terms. The response was swift. Marcus Wellington himself called Thomas's office that same afternoon, demanding an immediate meeting with Crystal Springs LLC representatives. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for July 7th at the Lakeside Estates Community Center. Thomas and I arrived 15 minutes early, setting up a small projector and screen. The room filled quickly with board members and concerned residents who had noticed the reduced water pressure. Marcus Wellington sat at the center of the board table, his expression a mixture of irritation and confidence. "I understand we have representatives from Crystal Springs LLC here tonight," Wellington announced once the meeting began. "Perhaps they can explain why they are interfering with our water system." Thomas nodded to me, and I stood. Several board members visibly recognized me as I walked to the front of the room. "Good evening," I began. "My name is Cooper. Most of you know me as the owner of Cooper Ranch, the property your pipeline crosses without proper compensation or restoration." Murmurs spread through the audience. "I am also the principal owner of Crystal Springs LLC, which now holds title to Crystal Springs Lake and all associated water rights." Wellington's expression transformed from dismissive to shocked. "This is some kind of joke," he sputtered. I connected my laptop to the projector and displayed the property deed, water rights certificate, and system engineering diagrams. "Not a joke, Mr. Wellington. Simply a change in circumstances that requires your attention." For the next 20 minutes, I methodically presented documentation of the damage done to my ranch during pipeline construction, complete with before and after photographs, cost estimates for restoration, and evidence of ignored communications. I then outlined my terms. First, fair compensation for damage to my property, totaling $157,000 based on independent assessments. Second, a revised easement agreement that properly restricts and defines pipeline access rights. Third, a public acknowledgement of the improper handling of the original easement process. And finally, establishment of a fair water usage agreement moving forward, with proper compensation for access to Crystal Springs. Wellington recovered quickly, his shock transforming to anger. "This is nothing short of extortion. We will challenge the property transfer. We will obtain court orders. The county will not allow you to hold 300 families hostage over a petty grievance." "This is not a grievance, petty or otherwise," I responded, maintaining my composure. This is a legitimate business negotiation between Crystal Springs LLC and Lakeside Estates HOA. You currently have no legal right to the water you are using. I am offering to establish such rights under reasonable terms. Several homeowners in the audience began asking pointed questions of Wellington and the board. Why had proper water rights never been secured? Why were complaints about construction damage ignored? How much of their monthly HOA fees had gone toward legal counsel instead of proper water rights agreements? As the meeting adjourned in disarray, Wellington approached me. With a forced smile, "We should discuss this privately, Cooper. I am sure we can reach an accommodation that works for everyone." "My terms are straightforward," I replied. "I look forward to your written response within 7 days. Until then, the current reduced flow will continue as a conservation measure while system evaluations are completed." I left the meeting with a strange mixture of satisfaction and caution. The first move had been made, but I suspected the real battle was just beginning. Wellington wasted no time launching a counteroffensive. 3 days after the HOA meeting, I was served with a temporary restraining order demanding restoration of full water flow while the courts reviewed the situation. Thomas assured me this was expected and already had a response prepared. "They are claiming essential service disruption," Thomas explained, "but their own engineering documents show the current flow exceeds minimum requirements for residential use. This is about their decorative fountains and over-irrigation, not household needs." The judge agreed, ruling that while I could not further reduce water flow during litigation, I was not required to restore it to previous levels. It was a small victory but an important one. Meanwhile, I reduced the water flow by another 10%, still within safe residential usage parameters, but enough to impact the community's non-essential water features. The massive fountain at the Lakeside Estates entrance now ran only 4 hours daily instead of 24. The community pool required longer fill times. Lawn irrigation systems operated at reduced capacity. The community began to divide visibly. Yard signs appeared throughout the development, some reading "Support fair water rights," and others declaring "Stop Cooper's revenge tactics." Social media groups formed on both sides of the issue. Local news stations picked up the story, with one investigative reporter digging into the HOA's financial records. The resulting exposé revealed that Wellington had directed HOA contracts worth millions to companies owned by former business partners. Maintenance fees had increased annually, while reserves for infrastructure improvements like proper water rights acquisition remained unfunded. Most damaging was the discovery that the HOA board had been informed of the precarious water rights situation 3 years earlier, but had chosen to ignore legal counsel's recommendation to secure proper agreements. By mid-August, a group calling themselves Lakeside Residents for Accountability had formed. Led by Elizabeth Chen, a retired municipal judge, they began advocating for new HOA leadership and a reasonable settlement with Crystal Springs LLC. "This situation is not about villainizing Mr. Cooper," Chen stated during a community meeting. "It is about addressing years of mismanagement by our board. The pipeline project was handled improperly from the beginning. The damage to Cooper Ranch was real and remains uncompensated. And most importantly, our community water supply was built on legally tenuous ground. We need to fix these problems, not fight losing legal battles." Wellington attempted to portray me as an opportunistic extortionist, even going so far as to claim I had deliberately manipulated Harold Johnson into selling me the property. This backfired spectacularly when Harold himself attended a town hall meeting, and described his years of frustration with the HOA's dismissive attitude. "I tried for 8 years to get a fair agreement for the water they were taking," Harold told the packed auditorium. "Cooper was the only one who respected my property and my wishes. If you want someone to blame for your situation, look at your own leadership." By early September, drought conditions intensified the water situation. I implemented a third reduction, bringing flow down to 60% of original levels. This still met all safety and residential requirements, but eliminated virtually all decorative and recreational water usage in the development. The community pool closed. The golf course irrigation system shut down. Lawn watering was restricted to twice weekly. The pressure on Wellington and the board intensified daily as property values began showing signs of decline. Elizabeth Chen's group called for an emergency HOA meeting to discuss a vote of no confidence in the current board. The community center was filled beyond capacity, with residents spilling out into the parking lot. Wellington attempted to maintain control of the meeting, but was repeatedly interrupted by angry homeowners. "My house is worth $30,000 less than it was 2 months ago," one resident shouted. "All because you chose to bully a rancher instead of securing proper water rights." Another stood to speak. "I reviewed the documents. Cooper's demands are not unreasonable. He wants compensation for actual damage done to his property and a proper legal agreement moving forward. Why are we fighting this?" Wellington tried one last desperate tactic, announcing that the county was considering condemning the lake property under eminent domain for public use. Thomas immediately stood to address this claim. "The county commissioners have indeed been approached with this request," Thomas confirmed. "However, they have already determined that a private HOA water supply does not qualify as essential public infrastructure under state law. This option is not available to the board." As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I watched from the back of the room. The community was reaching its breaking point, and Wellington was running out of options. The next move would determine whether this ended in further conflict or a path toward resolution. The emergency vote took place on September 23rd. By a margin of nearly 4-1, Lakeside Estates residents voted to remove Wellington and the entire HOA board. Elizabeth Chen was elected interim president with a mandate to resolve the water crisis and reform HOA governance. 3 days later, I received a call from Chen requesting a meeting at my ranch rather than at the HOA offices. She arrived with 2 other newly elected board members, but notably without attorneys or formal documents. "First, I want to apologize," Chen began as we sat on my back porch overlooking the damaged creek bed. "What happened to your property was wrong. The way your concerns were dismissed was wrong. The new board acknowledges this without reservation." She handed me a preliminary proposal that addressed each of my original demands. The compensation amount was actually higher than I had requested, including funds specifically earmarked for creek restoration. The easement agreement was revised to include strict limitations on access and maintenance requirements. Most importantly, they proposed a fair water rights agreement that acknowledged Crystal Springs as the source and included reasonable annual payments for access. "We would like to go beyond simply fixing past wrongs," Chen continued. "We are proposing a cooperative relationship between Lakeside Estates and Cooper Ranch." Their vision included creating a joint water conservation committee, establishing educational programs about responsible water usage, and developing a community-supported agriculture program where residents could purchase seasonal produce directly from my ranch. Over the next month, Thomas and Patricia worked with the HOA's new legal counsel to formalize the agreements. By November, all documents were signed, the first compensation payment was made, and water flow was fully restored to the community. That winter, I used part of the funds to begin restoring the creek bed. Environmental specialists helped design a natural filtration system that would gradually return the water to its former pristine condition. Native plants were reintroduced along the banks, and by spring, the first signs of wildlife returning were evident. The pipeline remained, but now it represented something different. A properly negotiated easement meant regular maintenance that respected my property and operations. Warning markers clearly delineated access routes for service personnel, and advance notice was required for any work. The following summer, the first school group from Lakeside Estates visited the ranch for what would become a regular educational program. 20 eager third graders learned about water conservation, sustainable agriculture, and the delicate balance between development and preservation. The looks on their faces when they saw cattle up close for the first time made all the difficult months worthwhile. Elizabeth Chen and I developed an unexpected friendship. During one of her visits to check on the creek restoration progress, she confided something surprising. "You know, many of us moved to Lakeside Estates because we wanted to be closer to nature, to have more space and cleaner air," she said. "Somehow, Wellington and the old board made us forget that. They turned us into exactly the kind of community many of us were trying to escape from in the city." The HOA implemented significant governance reforms, including transparent budgeting, term limits for board members, and a requirement that all major infrastructure decisions be put to a community vote. Water conservation became a cornerstone of community planning, with native landscaping replacing many of the thirsty decorative plants that had dominated common areas. 2 years after the pipeline conflict began, I stood on my back porch watching the sunset cast golden light across both my pastures and the rooftops of Lakeside Estates in the distance. The creek once again ran clear and healthy. The cattle grazed peacefully on land that had been properly restored. The pipeline continued its work, but now as part of a balanced system that respected both the resource and the land it traversed. The experience had cost me nearly everything financially, required countless sleepless nights, and pushed me to limits I had not known I possessed. Yet looking back, I realized that the fight had never truly been about water rights or pipelines or even compensation. It had been about something more fundamental: respect for the land, for heritage, and for the notion that even one person standing on principle can ultimately create positive change against seemingly insurmountable odds. Sometimes, justice requires more than simply being right. Sometimes it requires the courage to take control of your own destiny, even when all conventional paths seem closed. The pipeline that once represented corporate bullying now stood as a reminder that principled resistance, however difficult, can transform conflict into cooperation and division into community.